like so many things in the Trump administration these days, it is done by incompetent people who are not doing a serious thing. They're doing a silly thing badly because they want to win the cultural war.
Have you ever been using AI, asked a question, and gotten a response that you feel like is a little too woke? Well, the Trump administration is trying to fix that. After years of waging culture wars in Hollywood, on college campuses, and social media, the Trump administration is now setting its sights on AI. The government's currently attempting to leverage the FTC to effectively censor all AI outputs to ensure that they comply with a pro-MAGA worldview. And obviously, as AI becomes the engine powering search, education, government, our economy, the consequences of this type of censorship would be really significant. Mike Masnick is the co-founder of TechDirt, and he's been covering Trump's effort to censor woke AI. And today he's joining me to break down how this high-stakes battle is playing out, how Trump is weaponizing the FTC, and ultimately how this high-stakes battle over who gets to decide what these AI systems say, what they refuse to answer, and whose worldview they reflect is playing out. Mike, welcome to Free Speech Friday.
Hey, it's always good to be talking to you.
Today, I want to dive into this piece that you wrote on TechDirt about the FTC. And you wrote that the FTC, I love this headline, would like to decide which AI answers are too woke, and it is calling that consumer protection. Tell me a little bit about what's going on.
There's a bunch of different things happening here all at once, and it's a little bit complex and a little bit confusing, and sort of the FTC is relying on that confusion and complexity to try and, scare AI platforms into being less woke, I guess, is the real part of it. And what it is this particular FTC, and the chair of the FTC is this guy, Andrew Ferguson. And when he was applying for the job, there was like this one pager that he put together that, I don't know if it got leaked or he released it or whatever. And it made it very clear that he was on board with whatever, cultural fights Donald Trump wanted to pick. It was kind of funny because he talks about ending ideological lawfare by Lina Khan, who ran the FTC under the Biden administration, but taking on important issues. But then all of his issues were just all culture war nonsense, which, the FTC doesn't really have a role in.
What is the FTC and what's its traditional role?
Yeah, so the FTC, it has a few different roles, but the major one is that it's supposed to be about consumer protection, right? And protecting consumers from harm, mostly from sort of unfair and deceptive trade practices. So things related to commerce, which are unfair and deceptive. And so, if a company's out there promising that it's selling something that will do something wonderful that it can't actually promise, that's something that the FTC can go after. They go after companies for, running illegal scams and fake lotteries and all sorts of stuff like that. Basically, anything that might trick a consumer in a clearly unfair way, that's what the FTC is supposed to go after. And that's a useful function at times because there are bad actors out there who are trying to trick people out of their money, and having a government regulator being able to step in and stop them from doing that is valuable. It has some other ancillary features as well. It's often involved in reviewing with the Justice Department, reviewing antitrust issues. So if there's a merger, they'll review whether or not it's, acceptable under antitrust laws to allow for the merger to happen. The FTC can also bring, with the DOJ again, antitrust cases against companies. So it has sort of a broad purview, but the overarching theme is supposed to be consumer protection.
And how is that changing under Andrew Ferguson, and specifically in relation to this idea of woke AI?
He's definitely just trying to figure out any way to use the power of the office, not unlike the FCC, which, handles broadband and television regulation and things like that, to put his thumb on the scale in some way or another. And there have been all sorts of accusations, but this latest one is that they put out a proposed policy. This gets deep into the weeds of how the FTC works. There are things like rulemaking, which is a big official deal where they're presenting a rule that then effectively becomes a regulation. There has to be a comment period for that, and the FTC has to adopt the rule. This is not a rulemaking. This is just a policy, which is basically the FTC saying, this is how we are now going to be interpreting this law. So in this case, they put out this proposed policy statement saying that they're interpreting any attempt to what they refer to as steer AI results as potentially unfair and deceptive under their Section 5 authority. Section 5 is the law that basically says what the FTC can do to protect people from unfair and deceptive practices. And the argument is, it's almost clever. It says people expect when they're using AI tools, they expect to get, good, high quality, accurate results. I don't know if that's true. I mean, I think lots of AI tools aren't very good at that. And I'm not sure that everyone's expectations are that they're good, but the argument is that they're expecting certain high quality, competent, reasonable, accurate results. So if an AI company were to attempt to steer the outputs and change what they say, that could be going against what the consumer expects and therefore would be unfair and deceptive. And so you could sort of see a possible way that could kind of make sense. If you're expecting certain kinds of things and the company is giving you something different, they're trying to manipulate you into a certain direction, then sort of.
Yeah, what would be an example of that? I'm trying to think.
Say you're purchasing a timeshare or something, and you're promised all sorts of things, but in the background, whoever's selling you the timeshare is misleading you and sort of steering you towards a purchase that is against your best interest and effectively lying to you about what you're actually getting out of it. They promise you can use it, 4 weeks of the year, and the reality is that they block every possible time that you would want to use it. It's a scam. And so the argument is that this is the case here. That is not true for a variety of reasons. One is that the First Amendment pretty explicitly does not allow the FTC to go after someone for their editorial decision making, right? So there was an attempt in the past to go after Fox News for claiming itself to be fair and balanced, which, as someone who does not trust Fox News, I think the fair and balanced slogan is ridiculous and misleading. But is it so misleading that it becomes an unfair and deceptive practice? And what the court said was no, it's just sort of marketing hype, and it is their free speech right to say that. So that got rejected. But here, he's sort of ignoring all that history and effectively saying, well, if we find that the results are what we say consumers are not expecting, that would be unfair and deceptive. The obvious implication of this is any AI that produces answers that Andrew Ferguson and his culture war FTC deems to be problematic, they could suddenly be investigated by the FTC. I don't think anyone thinks that he could win a lawsuit, but the process is the punishment. If the FTC opens an investigation into you, that is a very, very expensive, very, very time-consuming process that is not helpful. Therefore, the thinking is that many AI companies, especially smaller ones, will then decide okay, let's make sure that our AI never gives answers that talks about the existence of slavery in the US, for example, because how dare we admit that what happened in the US and that it was bad. It's clearly designed to create a chilling effect because you might get investigated if you don't make sure that the AI is answering in a way that MAGA approves. Then you might face an investigation.
This video is sponsored by Delete Me, a service I actually use. And let me tell you why. A while ago, I Googled my own name, and what came up honestly freaked me out so much. My home address, my phone number, even my relatives' names. And a lot of this stuff was data that I had zero idea was public. Data brokers can legally collect and sell all kinds of information about you. And people search sites are some of the worst. They bundle up your personal information and they basically sell it to anyone with a credit card. That can expose you to serious risks like scams, identity theft, even doxing. That's why I use Delete Me to protect my privacy. It's a hands-free subscription service that removes your personal information from hundreds of data brokers, so your data is less likely to end up in the wrong hands. You can see how many listings they found with your information, what they removed, and just think of how many hours of work they will save you. 3 things I love about Delete Me. 1, they've been doing this for over 15 years, so it's been a while. 2, they do all the removals with their own technology, so they're not handing your data over to third parties. And 3, there are real human privacy advisors that you can reach out to if you need help with something specific. Get 20% off Delete Me consumer plans when you go to joindeleteme.com/Taylor20 and use promo code Taylor20 at checkout, or use the QR code on screen. That's joindeleteme.com/Taylor20. Start protecting yourself today. When they say that like this is what consumers expect, is there like any data like whatsoever? Like, do they have to like find some random guy in Florida that will like testify to this?
Yeah, normally if the FTC were proposing something like this, yes, they would present some sort of data and some sort of proof and some sort of evidence. In this case, they don't. They just sort of make the claim and just put it out there that this is what consumers expect. And if it differs from that, then that's a problem. Like so many things in the Trump administration these days, it is done by incompetent people who are not doing a serious thing. They're doing a silly thing badly because they want to win the culture war. And so that's what you get. But yes, I mean, I don't think this would ever get to any reasonable level of a court case. But if it did, then yes, the FTC would, in theory, then be told that they have to present some sort of evidence of, what is the expected behavior for consumers.
And I assume that they're not doing this either because, like you mentioned, it's sort of just like incompetence and laziness. But like, are they giving the AI companies any idea of the type of content that they want censored? Or is this mostly just like what for the companies to kind of guess?
It's more guessing. This is how the sort of Great Firewall of China worked in the early days. Like now it's a much more sophisticated operation. But when China first sort of decided that they were going to make the internet more appropriate, I guess would be the way they put it, for Chinese users, what they would do is send these sort of vague notices to internet service providers and say, if anything bad happens on your service, loosely defined, we will hold you liable. And the way that the ISPs responded was just like take down anything that might be problematic in any way possible, which means you get massive overblocking and massive, like anything that any government official might object to has to come down. And so it's this censorship by winking and nodding, right? As opposed to specifically calling out which things are an issue. And so like I pointed to in the article that there's a former FTC lawyer who had posted this sort of sarcastic open letter on LinkedIn responding to this request and basically asking the FTC, can you please publish a quarterly schedule of which ideological positions are approved and which are not? And saying, I mean, it's very funny because it really calls out how ridiculous this is and says, well, if you put out this notice and this proposed policy, obviously you've had it justified under the First Amendment. And therefore, the only way that could be true is if you have like a clear list of what ideological viewpoints are acceptable and which are not. Therefore, could you please publish it just so we know what needs to be blocked and what doesn't? And just sort of making a mockery of the entire thing because it's designed to be mocked.
Yeah. I mean, but I feel like the comparisons to China are kind of apt in the sense of like a lot of the ways that China exerts power over speech is this sort of like vague pressure. I mean, as you mentioned, I guess it's more explicit now in terms of the firewall, but even just like within China and a lot of these authoritarian countries, they're never going to actually sort of come out and say it, but it's sort of like implied. And so these companies will over censor. I mean, I'm even thinking of this right now with all of this obsession with sort of age appropriate content for children. You see the result is that Meta over censors and they over censor anything that the Trump administration doesn't like or the Biden administration when it's Biden. Obviously, Trump is way worse on this, but how will this play out? Because in a sense, you're right. It's like, it's worth mocking. It's ridiculous. But also this is a government agency and it seems like they're kind of moving ahead with this. So like it's maybe for real. Like,
yeah, I mean, it'll exist. The question is, how far will they actually go with it? Right. So right now there's this comment period that's open. They have no real reason to actually pay attention to the comments, but that doesn't mean the comments aren't important. They are important just for establishing the historical record that people objected to this, that people called out the problems with it. And that could come in handy down the road, especially if it does go to court and the FTC tries to claim that this was a totally reasonable policy that everybody agreed was wonderful. If there's the evidence, and then any comments that are added are publicly available, you can say no, 90% of the people who responded to the comment period pointed out that this was unconstitutional garbage. That's helpful for the public record. But, what I think will happen is that they will ignore the comments and then say, this is now the official policy. And then likely they'll just sort of use it to saber rattle. And there will be some story, who knows when, 6 months from now, something will come up and someone will find a result coming out of ChatGPT that they'll say, look at this woke AI because it did it. It may even be Elon Musk, right? I mean, he wants to beat up on OpenAI and talk about how wonderful Grok is. So he'll find some result that someone got it to generate and say, look at this ridiculous, totally woke result. It's, violating expectations. And Andrew Ferguson will jump up and wave around this whole policy and say, we're going to investigate this because it is a violation of our consumer protection rules. And then OpenAI will be forced to come out and say, we're always adjusting our thing and trying to get it, all of the nonsense.
But they'll have to pay, right? That is, like you said, the process is the punishment, right? This is still negative for them.
Oh, totally. Yeah. The worst situation too is, right, OpenAI has a ridiculous amount of money, right? They're losing money, but they've raised so much cash that they can afford the top lawyers who will do a good job and fight back, and eventually this will go away. But, what really worries me is there's a lot of smaller players out there that are building AI tools that I think are more important. And I want there to be a competitive market because I don't want everyone to be forced to use one of 4 models that are owned by giant companies with diverging interests to their actual users. I want there to be other models. I want there to be smaller models. I want there to be specific models for specific purposes. But the more we do things like this, the more difficult we make that, and the more we actually drive all the AI business into, just a few giant companies. And I don't think that's a healthy result for anyone.
It feels so similar to a lot of the social media stuff too, where I brought up the Meta example, but all of this, right? And you have Elon Musk, who obviously wants to take out all his kind of competitors. But we've seen a massive amount of censorship over that again, the companies just sort of abide by. And so I guess what I'm concerned about is if this goes to pass, because there's no transparent process and it's all sort of implied, there's also no way to legally review it or get any transparency.
There's no transparency. There's no auditing. The companies can do things on the back end that will change their systems just to avoid ever having these kinds of results. there was a few years ago in the early days of these AI systems where, Google's AI, before it was even called Gemini. Somebody had asked the image generation tool to generate images of the founding fathers. And it presented a bunch of images of founding fathers who were not all white men. And you know why that happened, right? You know that somebody put in some sort of prompt that was basically trying to recognize that not all image generation results should show up as white men, because if you don't do that, that's what it's been trained on. That's what the results are going to be. But in this particular case, if someone's asking for the founding fathers, they were white men. So it should generate it, but it wasn't. So then suddenly it's oh no, Google's producing woke AI. That's sort of an extreme example. It was very, very silly, but it became this article of faith among the MAGA folks that oh my gosh, Google is so woke that they won't even let you present the reality that the founding fathers were white men.
Which led to a lot of people using Grok. My friend was telling me about his dad who literally spends all day talking to Grok, and he's convinced that everything else is woke. And it seems like it resonated again. It's people believe some of this stuff, right? They consume these news stories and they get mad about it. And the culture war works in a lot of ways.
That is the purpose of the culture war, right? It is to get you mad about things that have reasonable explanations, in which they want you to believe that there is no reasonable explanation for this and it's horrible. It's a sign of a problem. And this particular attempt by the FTC is designed to just pump that up, right? They will now go hunting. And I'm sure, Elon Musk or other people on X, because it's all going to be people on X, are going to CC Andrew Ferguson and the FTC on any AI result that they find to be too woke in some form, and will call it out and call for an investigation. And it just creates this general sense that I think will likely drive a bunch of AI companies to try and change their prompts in the other way, to try and limit any of those kinds of results. And, we know that leads to inaccurate outputs in the other direction. And that is also a problem.
Yeah, it just seems like overall this infrastructure for censorship is being created, but it's not so overt. It's almost like
right.
Ridiculous thing, and then it ends up having real bad consequences.
I mean, we've seen that over and over again in the Trump administration, especially with the FCC, but now with the FTC as well, in that they're using the levers of power that they have to target speech and then pretending and acting shocked that anyone would think that they were targeting speech for ideological reasons. They're saying, no, we're just applying the laws. We have this power to stop unfair and deceptive practices. And if people are expecting the AI not to be woke, how dare it be woke? And it's like, unless you really follow this stuff, it can sound reasonable. You can take each step of this process and look at it and say yeah, sure, the FTC should stop things that are tricking people or that it goes against the expectations of the consumers. That's what the FTC is supposed to be doing. But, this is not that. This is them clearly trying to get into the editorial process and adjust it in a way that they want it to come out.
It seems like there's just and you write about all of them, these growing attempts to circumvent the First Amendment protections that we have through this idea of defective products or scams or product liability, whatever. And it seems like this is being pretty, it's been pretty successful legally. I mean, you talk about if this goes to court, they lose on speech grounds, but would they? I don't know. I mean, these product liability suits against social media are going forward. I don't know. It seems like these novel strategies are kind of working.
Yeah. I mean, I think they're working at the margins, and there's a lot of public discussion of the cases where they are working. To be honest, a lot of them have not worked. And it's been, we've gone through almost a decade now of those kinds of approaches not really working. There are a few cases that have worked. In my mind, a lot of it's just sort of probing, testing all these different theories in slightly different variations to figure out what actually resonates with a judge, or in the most recent cases with juries, where juries, you can get them to a stage where it's emotional and get results that are problematic.
It's also science is not determined by this is why we don't have jury trials to determine scientific realities on things.
Yeah. I mean, there are a bunch of problems with it. One hopes that for something like this, when you're talking about administrative law, that would get taken care of by judges and wouldn't ever become sort of a jury issue. I mean, it's problematic, right? I mean, I think there have been certainly some pretty systematic attempts to figure out how do we route around or under the First Amendment in ways that are convincing to judges. And in some cases, it's working. And that's certainly a concern of mine. But for the most part, I think the First Amendment still stands and still holds. And for something like this,
we've got it for now. It's getting chipped away. Speaking of the First Amendment, there's been so much conversation around AI and speech protections. Obviously, this debate on kind of where does the First Amendment apply with AI output? And even here, you're mentioning all this stuff about, speech protections but this is AI generated output. Is that even covered by the First Amendment? Can you kind of break those sort of questions down?
This is trickier than it should be. And I think it's tough for a lot of people to wrap their heads around. But the simplest version of it to think of is that AI generated output can still be expressive. All sorts of things can be expressive. And if it's expressive, then for the most part, with very limited exceptions, it is protected under the First Amendment. And we want that to be so. And I know that upsets some people, and people are saying, well, it's a computer, it has no rights, and therefore we shouldn't consider there to be any protections there. But the simplest way to think about the problem that we would have if AI output was not protected by the First Amendment is simply that if it's not, then we don't have to go through any of this facade that Andrew Ferguson is going through. Donald Trump can just say, OpenAI, you need to have MAGA only results. And if you don't say stuff that we like, we'll punish you, and you can't complain because the AI output there's no First Amendment protections there. The argument is not really about the First Amendment protections so much of the the computer generation, but rather the companies themselves and their editorial controls. And that gets into a whole other thing where people say, well, the companies shouldn't have any First Amendment rights. And then you get to the thing where it's like, if companies don't have First Amendment rights, then the New York Times doesn't exist. There's like all sorts of things where it's like, I understand the complaints, but like each thing that people want in terms of like, oh, the First Amendment shouldn't apply to that leads you to a very, very bad place very quickly.
Yes, which I think is like, I think it's really hard for people to understand that sort of like second order effect. And I don't know how you get through to them, Mike, because like, I feel like you write about this all day, but like when you post about this stuff online, or I shared this in a group chat, people will be like, well, the government should take control, right? Like these addictive algorithms or the problematic AI that's telling everyone to kill themselves or whatever, like, well, the government should seize control over it. And, I think there's a lot of frustration with tech, obviously.
Yeah. And look, the frustration with tech is real, but like right now the government is run by Donald Trump, right? and for a while the government was really run by Elon Musk. And are we happy with the control that he has over the recommendation algorithm on X? I don't think so. I think what people are really concerned about, and this is a reasonable concern, is that you have these big, powerful companies whose interests are not aligned with their users. And that is a real issue, but you don't solve that by saying, well, we give the government control, because the more centralized control you have, then it just becomes a bigger and bigger target. And then Elon Musk will spend as much money as he can in order to have the influence to control what that looks like. The real answer is to not have so much power be in the hands of just a few incredibly wealthy, centralized entities that can be taken over and can be controlled this way. The real answer is to have the power distributed and to have many, many different players and providers, hopefully in a world where they can communicate with each other separately, but you don't have any sort of central angle of control and power. And there are ways to get there, but it's different than saying give government control over the algorithms.
Yeah, there's been this big debate. I just posted a video about it today about open weight models, I guess, or, these more open systems. I mean, is this an argument for open weight models? I mean, theoretically, these models would be even harder for the government to censor at all.
Yeah, absolutely. It is sort of the same issue in a slightly different set of clothes, where there are open weight models now that you can run locally. I mean, I'm running a bunch of models myself on a local machine that, I don't have to send the data that I use the models for to a giant company. They just stay on my local computer. And I think that is really empowering and can be much more powerful than having to worry about what is OpenAI doing, what is Google doing, what is Anthropic doing with my data, how are they deciding which results, I can change things myself and tweak them myself. But now suddenly there's this big fight, which is brewing over, whether or not like the US would ban open weight models, there's this big fear of like most of the open weight models right now, not all, but most of them are coming from China. So suddenly you have this whole like US China fight that is happening. It's all sort of the same fight. And the reality is the only way that we get through this in a way where it's not sort of government or super rich, powerful companies in control of these things is to have more open, competitive, local tools that we can use. And that includes the open weight AI tools.
Yeah, more sort of decentralization and less consolidation of power, whether that's government or corporate. Well, Mike, thank you so much for covering all of this. Can't wait to continue to read about it all on TechDirt. And I really encourage people so can anybody submit a comment for this thing? Or
it is wide open and it's very easy. You don't need a lawyer. You just have to go to the site and you can submit a comment just right in the form. If you want to do a longer one, you can upload a PDF. And they make it pretty straightforward. Just recognize that anything that you submit will be listed publicly. Government record. Well, I'll put the link in the comments for anybody that does want to make their voice heard. And thank you so much for joining me. Thanks for having me. This is always fun. All right. That's it for this week's episode of Free Speech Friday. If you like my work, please buy a paid subscription to my Substack at usermag.co. That's usermag.co, or support me on Patreon via the link below. On my Substack and Patreon, I do bonus content. I send a weekly newsletter of everything that I'm reading and following online. I don't really have very much advertiser support, if any, on this channel. It's certainly not enough to live off of. And the only way that I can remain an independent journalist is thanks to the direct support of people like you. So truly, if you feel like my coverage is important, please buy a paid subscription to my Substack at usermag.co. It's the best way to support me. Again, you can also support me on Patreon via the link below. I'll be back next week with a brand new episode of Power User. See you then.